Hello, everyone. I'm Peter March, the Executive Dean of the Rutgers School of Arts and Sciences. If this is your first virtual Scarlet Speaker event, I'd like to welcome you. And if it's not, welcome back. A little housekeeping before we get started. As a reminder, we've muted everyone's microphones so there are no background noises during the presentation. We ask that you use the chat feature to submit any questions you may have. Make sure you're selecting all participants so that everyone can see the message and the question you're asking. After the conversation's done, Joyce and Barry will take submitted questions. If they have any follow-up questions for you, we'll be able to unmute you so you can ask. This event will also be recorded and stored online for viewing after the event. Also, please know, these events are not just for Rutgers alumni. If you have friends or family who you think would enjoy these talks, please forward them the invitation. So now it's a pleasure to introduce today's guests. Joyce Carol Oates is a recipient of the National Medal of Humanities, the National Book Critics Circle Ivan Sandrock Lifetime Achievement Award, the LA Times Book Prize, the National Book Award, and the Penn Malamed Award for Excellence in Short Fiction. On Monday, Joyce won France's richest books prize, the Cino del Duca World Prize, which is often seen as the stepping stone to the Nobel Prize. Joyce has written some of the world's most enduring fiction of our time, including the national bestsellers We Were the Mulvaneys, Blonde, which also was nominated for the National Book Award, and the New York Times bestseller The Falls, which won the 2005 Prix Femina. She's the Roger S. Berlin Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at Princeton University, a visiting Distinguished Professor of English at Rutgers University, and she's been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters since 1978. Barry V. Qualls joined the Department of English at Rutgers College in 1971 and retired in January 2017. He's taught over 3,000 undergraduates the wonders of 19th century British fiction, and also offered courses on the Bible and its literatures, on reading poetry, and on storytelling. He served as Vice President for Undergraduate Education and Dean of Humanities. In 2006, he was named New Jersey Professor of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. At Rutgers, Barry received the Sussman Award for Excellence in Teaching, the FAS Award for Distinguished Contributions to Undergraduate Education, and the Douglas Medal for Service to Douglas College. So I do hope that the Cino del Duca World Prize predicts a Nobel Prize, but I'm very, very pleased to note it has accurately predicted Scarlet Speakers. So with that, please join me in welcoming Joyce and Barry.
It's a pleasure to be here today. I have known Joyce Carol Oates for 40 years, and we both look forward to this, and it's nice to see so many attendees, if I may say, many of them former students of mine, and Joyce herself taught at Rutgers a special course in creative writing at Rutgers this past term, and in the middle of which she also, of course, became an online teacher for the first time. So Joyce, welcome. I want to talk a good deal about your writing career. That is to say, your move into writing as a young woman, or actually a girl. But before we start, why don't you tell us something about teaching at Rutgers this past semester, our students and the challenges?
Well, I thought it was really a wonderful experience. It's sort of bifurcated because right in the middle, I think around March 13th or 15th, we all shut down. So it's like there were two experiences. One was in 3 dimensions where we sat around a table and had wonderful discussions. And then the other was artificial, the Zoom situation, where not all the students were always able to participate. So it became really 2 different experiences. But the writers themselves, I think, were very resilient and very enthusiastic and excellent writers. I enjoyed it very much.
You've been writing, of course, as you say in one of your memoirs, The Lost Landscape. You've been writing virtually since you were a child. Could you tell us something about the environment in terms of books that you grew up in and the discoveries of books that have mattered to you your entire writing life?
Well, I do remember when I must have been really very little, I had tablets, which we all had, lined tablets. I'm sure you had that also, Barry. And I would scribble on this tablet, and I would draw pictures of chickens and cats because we lived on a small farm, and chickens and cats were, I think, the most ambitious figures that I could draw. I didn't feel up to drawing adults, I guess. But I was scribbling on this tablet before I could write. So my mother kept these tablets where there was very earnest scribbling, the kind of industry that you would see in Tolstoy and Reading War and Peace, except it's just childish scribbles. I couldn't write yet.
Did you come from a family with lots of books?
Well, my family didn't have any books at all, really. But I did have a grandmother, my father's mother, who began giving me books when I was quite little. And the first of my great books was Alice in Wonderland, Alice Through the Looking Glass, when I was about 8 or 9 years old. So that really changed my life. And after that, when I was scribbling and writing, I was sort of pretending that I was writing about Alice in Wonderland, I think.
Yeah, I've made some notes about things you've said in the various writings about Alice in Wonderland. And I did want to read just one sentence. Here is the springboard into the imagination. Here is my model of what a storybook can be. Fantasies that shade by degrees into nightmare. Could you talk about that in terms of your own writing life?
I read Alice in Wonderland so many times over the years that my memory is kind of layered. But I think as a little girl, the first time I read it, I was absolutely transported. I was enthralled. There was a little girl who was the heroine. Of course, I didn't have that concept. But this is a little girl who was not frightened, even though strange, nightmarish things were happening. She didn't even terror. She didn't start to cry. She didn't do any of the things that probably most children would do. So this was probably, without my knowing it, some sort of stepping stone, let's say, to an elevated sense of self. And another thing that's most exciting about the Lewis Carroll books is that Alice is much more mature, and she's very skeptical. She's more mature than the adults around her, who are nearly always somewhat insane, or psychotic, or extremely narcissistic. They're very ignorant, and they're very willful. Some of them are malicious. Some of them are cannibals. They're eating one another. But in the middle, Alice maintains her autonomy. There are a number of passages where somebody's talking like the Red Queen or the Duchess, and it says, Alice did not agree. Alice did not think so. And that's really quite revolutionary for children's literature.
And it's also, of course, about young girls who are totally fearless in most ways.
Yes.
And you've actually, in your novels and short stories, there are many, many remarkable women figures in them. I know, because I've known you a long time, I know that you have been a close friend of Elaine Showalter's for many years, and that you and she used to talk about many of these issues involving a feminist approach to thinking about literature, thinking about culture. Could you say something about the way your sense of the feminist movement entered into your life as a writer?
Probably it entered in the feminist movement and the sense of reading women's literature came relatively late in my writing career. When I was an undergraduate, well, even before then, when I was in high school, I was quite enthralled with Faulkner and Hemingway. Hemingway was my first great influence. It sounds a little pompous. I was in high school, but I was still taken with the Nick Adams stories. They are so beautifully sculpted and so minimalist, and they give the illusion to a young writer that maybe I can do that. You wouldn't have that feeling if you're reading Milton or reading Faulkner or James Joyce. A really young writer wouldn't feel that she was up to that. But Hemingway's early stories, which are about a young boy named Nick Adams. We're really about young people my own age, so I guess I could identify with that. And I kind of became a person who immersed herself in a writer. First it was Hemingway, as I said. Then I got very interested in Faulkner, who's sort of the antithesis of Hemingway. And I won't go into a long lecture on the subject, but the two are very different. Their sense of consciousness, the sense of what fiction should be and what literature is, are very, very different. With Faulkner, the past is very important. With Hemingway is this existential present tense, sort of moving forward. So when I was in college, I was very taken with Kafka, and I was reading Thomas Mann, and I was reading Stendhal, and very much James Joyce, and again Faulkner. So it wasn't until I was a bit older I became interested in women writers. I was more of a formalist. I was interested in the forms of fiction, and ultimately, that is what I am interested in. I'm interested in experimental fiction and the forms of fiction. The content that I write about could be feminist, but what really excites me is the forms of fiction.
Right. You talked about the kind of writers that you read, and then your own involving interest in form. Could you say something more about how you define form?
Well, let's see, form. A writer has to make a decision what the strategy or presentation of the work is. You may have an interesting story in your own life. Your life may be interesting, and you might want to write a memoir. You have to make a coolly calibrated decision how you're going to present that material. Is it going to be a memoir? If it's a memoir, how are you going to begin? You have to decide what you're going to focus, because there has to be a sort of story or narrative with a precise focus, perhaps even on an image, or you're seeing your life as a series of images or dramatic experiences. You'll soon discover that you have to leave out about 90% of your life. Art is very selective, and you can't put everything in. I've been rereading War and Peace since the lockdown. And of course, War and Peace is a very long novel written at a time when the idea of the novel as a very artistic work hadn't really been explored that much. This is relatively early. So Tolstoy was 35 years old. He was feeling his way into a different kind of narrative. It was an epic with a lot of military history put into it. It's very much in contrast to Anna Karenina and to later novels that are much more selective. Tolstoy just put so much in that I think probably most readers probably skim parts of it. So if you're writing a novel, you have to be able to focus on the dramatic interludes that make the novel, that give the novel meaning. You can't put everything in. Experimental writing is usually experimental in terms of voice. You might want to tell the story from the point of view of a voice it's not your own voice, but it's a mediated voice. And all these decisions you have to make really before you start writing.
Right. Before we get to some specific novels, I want to say something about the location of the settings of your novels. Upstate New York, of course, in the areas where you were born, but also in Detroit and LA. And you once said, "We are all regionalists in our origins. However universal our themes and characters." Could you talk a bit about the ways that your conception of a novel determines the landscape?
Well, we are all regionalists, except people who live in New York City. Just imagine that, as the center of the universe. Most writers discover what we might call the universal by going into the regional. One of the great examples would be William Faulkner in our American literature. He basically stayed in Mississippi imaginatively, just focused, and with his writing extremely experimental and dramatizing and exploring different points of view and perspectives, different idioms. Light in August has these sudden leaps in time and almost cinematic movement. Faulkner was experimenting with these techniques, perhaps he was not even necessarily conscious of doing it. James Joyce is very much a conscious experimenter. And what I like about Joycean literature, and probably identify most with James Joyce more than any other writer, which would seem surprising to many people. Surprising because Joyce never wrote about anything violent. He never talks about things like the potato famine. He doesn't go into the physical anguish and tragic suffering that many Irish people dealt with, and other Irish writers wrote about. Joyce didn't want to write about that. He was doing other things. Joyce is the great artist of the everyday, and he evokes life in its sensuousness. So it's as if we're really there in Dublin in 1904. And that's my ideal for my own writing, not to tell a story that's summarized or once upon a time, but to evoke experiences for the reader that are very visceral and sensuous, so that you're reading along, it's as if you're really there. You're not reading about something that happened a long time ago.
In your novels, as you know, one of my favorites has always been Because It Is Bitter and Because It Is My Heart. You've continually examined the issues of race in the culture of the novel, as well as in the culture of this country, since your novels constantly, it seems to me, move outside the domestic into a kind of epic sense of a nation. Could you talk about the roles of race? I know you have a new novel coming out where that is also an issue.
Well, basically, I was writing about experiences that I had had myself that are sort of on the margins of racial events, maybe violent, almost like lynchings, events in American history that I didn't participate personally in as a witness, but I was sort of living at the same time. I lived in the city of Detroit at the time of the civil uprising, if we call it, civil disturbances that were sometimes called riots. The Detroit Riot is sort of a newspaper. It's a sensational name for Black people sort of trapped in the ghetto, rising up against white police officers who for decades had been doing awful things to them, and sort of rising up one night in July 1967. My husband Ray and I were living in Detroit at that time. We were living at a place, it was called 7 Mile Road. And what was happening was way downtown in the center city of Detroit. But the fires and gunshots and sirens sort of moved out from that core. So we were only about 1 block from burning buildings, and we heard gunfire. And being a white person in Detroit at that time, I didn't really know it, but most of the news that I received through the newspapers and the media was actually censored. We didn't really have any real idea what the police were doing, what was going on. It was all sort of censored. It wasn't until maybe 20 years later when I went back to do research. Doing research, yeah.
You actually said that Detroit was your great subject, and that it clearly is a part of is particularly important in the novel Them. Could you talk a bit about the way you moved into the subjects of your novels?
Well, I usually begin with a scene or an image. That's sort of my way in. It's like opening a door. You mentioned Because It Is Bitter, Because It Is My Heart. I can say the beginning of that is my memory when I was fairly young. I was only about 11 years old. I was doing things that children are not allowed to do today because all children had much more freedom. Our parents didn't hover over us. I took a Greyhound bus into Lockport, New York, and went to school in Lockport. I was riding on the bus, I was in a bus station with a lot of adults. I was only 11 and 12. I was probably fairly young for my age. So I also would leave school grounds at lunchtime and I would have lunch in a diner all by myself, just this girl. And so that's in that novel, the girl, the daughter, whose mother becomes an alcoholic and she dies kind of a tragic death. She's sort of all alone, and she goes to a restaurant and she's paying for her own lunch. And that was my way in. She was doing exactly what I was doing, and all the visual memories of her walking in the street in downtown are absolutely all my own.
Right. I want to talk about some specific novels, but first I want to ask you something about the short story. You've done many short stories. I mean, you've worked in almost all genres: poetry, plays, essays, and short stories, and won awards for the short stories as well. I taught a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, I taught Faithless, a story that I must say in a large class called Why We Tell Stories that the students really loved. And it made me think as I was preparing for our discussion today about the pressures writing a short story puts on a writer. Could you talk about the different kinds of experiences you have writing a short story versus a novel?
Well, obviously, a novel is much more difficult. A novel is like an enormous vehicle that you have to build and put together, and then hope that it will have some ability to move, and there's a certain momentum to it. A short story can be just a very short narrative that maybe could summed up in a sentence. My story, Faithless, is actually a fairly long story, and it tracks the suspicions of two girls that their mother had left them, and their mother had betrayed them. She'd run away from home and left them with their father, and they're on this farm. It's only through the story, as they get a little older and things happen, they discover that the mother had never left the farm, but the father had killed her. And they discover that the way the reader discovers it, it's something that is revealed and illuminated at the end of the story. But it is a story that's very contained within that trajectory. Whereas a novel is populated with a number of people. It usually takes place over a period of time, and it may move around in space as well as time. The novel is much more challenging. The novel is often a cause for despair and frustration. That's why I suggest to my writing students that they start off with stories, then maybe longer stories, and then maybe a novella. But to plunge in and try to write a novel when you're fairly young is just asking for a lot of psychological anguish and misery. So I don't usually recommend that.
Well, you said actually that about a number of your novels that as you were writing, or indeed in the approach to the writing, you were haunted by the writing. You said that about Blonde. You said that about Because It's Bitter. Could you say some things about being haunted by your material?
Yes, I was haunted by those days when I took the Greyhound bus into Lockport, New York. I was haunted by walking alone along the city streets and looking at the Erie Barge Canal. I did that so many times. I was always alone. Something of my personality was shaped then, because I often have scenes like that in my writing. Like The Gravedigger's Daughter has a lot. The same scenes come back. I realize, oh, I've written this before. She's standing at the same place at the canal and looking down. Her thoughts are different. She's a different person, but it's sort of the same thing. I'm very haunted by going over the pedestrian bridge as a train goes by, and the train makes the pedestrian bridge tremble, and you're way, way high up in the air and looking down at this water, which is churning water. So I'm really haunted by that. Almost everything I write begins with something like that, and sometimes the hauntedness is given to one of the characters. Now, it's not really good in psychological terms to be so haunted or obsessed with an image, but if it is something that happens to you and arises out of your unconscious, it is an advantage as a writer, because then you can explore it.
So let's talk just a bit about a novel that has clearly been a major part of the public sense of you, and that is Blonde, what's called the Marilyn Monroe novel. I heard you give an interview once where you talked about how the material of Marilyn Monroe became an obsession for you, even in your dreams, as you wrote this very long novel. Could you speak a bit about the conception of a blonde and also the way it haunted you and the way you determined the kinds of shapes and formal issues?
I always think of that. I think of Blonde and the experience of writing that. Thinking of what Muhammad Ali said after one of his fights with Joe Frazier, the closest thing to dying. I mean, it's like the fights between Ali and Frazier almost killed both of the men. It almost didn't matter who was winning because it was so devastating. That's to make it sound a little melodramatic. But if you take on a subject that is very, very challenging, you don't quite realize until you get into it that maybe you're not strong enough to do it. So I actually had some heart palpitations. I remember having psychosomatic symptoms related to this novel, which became a little bit like, I'm changing the metaphor, a little bit like that ghoul that sits on the chest of the woman, you know.
In the painting, yes.
The nightmare, I think it's called, a nightmare, where it's sort of grinning and looking out at the viewer, and she's in this catatonic state. But I was haunted by Norma Jean Baker. It wasn't Marilyn Monroe, in which I had much interest. Marilyn Monroe was the performance. She was the costume and the hair. I mean, it wasn't real hair, it was bleached hair, but it could have easily been a wig. And Marilyn Monroe was very made up. And Norma Jean Baker was different, and she is the one I was haunted by.
Right, right. I want to ask one more question about the Monroe novel and then to go to some recent fiction. In the Monroe novel, you choose certain devices. Norma Jean is always a constant, but Marilyn Monroe is sometimes called the blonde actress. She marries Joe DiMaggio, but in the novel, he's called the ex-athlete. Could you say something about how these individuals get subsumed into categories?
Yes, the novel starts off when Norma Jean is a little girl. She has a mother who's attractive, but her mother is a paranoid schizophrenic, evidently. I don't know whether I actually say that in the novel, who can't really be a mother. She can't hug her daughter. She doesn't really like to touch other people. So Norma Jean doesn't have a proper mother. She doesn't have a loving mother. Her father never acknowledged her, and the mother wasn't married to the father. So Norma Jean begins as this very lonely orphan. It's almost like a Dickensian situation.
Actually, the introduction reminds me of Dickens as well. I mean,
Yeah,
the writing reminds me of Dickens.
Absolutely. Dickens was always there. He understood that we're all orphans. And no matter how old we are, we're searching for our mothers. But some of us actually had mothers, so we have memories. Whereas Norma Jean never really had a mother. This woman put her in foster homes as if she was an orphan. She put her in an orphanage, a Los Angeles County orphanage. So, but little Norma Jean couldn't be adopted. The other orphans could be adopted, but Norma Jean had her mother. It's just that her mother couldn't take care of her. So in the beginning of the novel, we're with Norma Jean. Then she becomes a starlet, and that word is not even used anymore, but that starlet was like a whole platoon of young girls.
Mostly blonde.
Yeah. And the studios were sort of exploiting them and hoping that one of them would turn into the next Betty Grable. And then she gets, I'm condensing a lot of history here. Anyway, she gets her name, Marilyn Monroe, at a certain point. They give her a name.
And that's when, of course, she begins to become a commodity.
She becomes a
consumable.
commodity. Yeah, but she was eager to be a commodity. She was eager to be loved. She had some facial surgery. She was brunette, and her hair was bleached. So then she had her first movie success, which is Don't Bother to Knock with Richard Widmark. And she is so good. She's on her way. She's Marilyn Monroe, a starlet. But then soon after that, she's in Niagara. And that's the big movement into stardom. There are billboards all around the country with this slinky, blonde seductress no longer the starlet. Now she's a full-blown phenomenon. So beyond that point, the image of Marilyn Monroe is a commodity. But before that, in the early movies like Don't Bother to Knock, she was an actress. She was playing a role. Then later on, she becomes sort of Marilyn Monroe as a performer in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And that's the image that Andy Warhol took and vulgarized and made very, very ugly. It takes her innocent beauty, because Andy Warhol is also a critic of mass production. But he takes that image of this beautiful, innocent girl with the glowing skin, he takes that image and makes it ugly, and then he replicates it. Then moving on, later on in the novel, she's often in a stupor. She is given amphetamines by the production doctor, and she's given barbiturates, prescription barbiturates by the studio so she can sleep at night. She enters a late phase of kind of hallucinatory quasi-reality. She's a blonde actress. So she no longer even has her own identity. And then she meets the people whom you mentioned, who relate to her as the blonde actress.
Right, right. One of the people who's watching, Payful Case, asked the question, of all the novels you have written, which is most close to your heart? Which is your favorite?
Well, that's hard to answer. It's like asking a mother or a parent, which child is the favorite. Because the Marilyn Monroe novel cost me so much in my psychic experience, I probably would say that was, in a way, my favorite novel. And though I almost died writing it. I don't even know how I got through. It was 1,400 pages, but I had to cut it back to only about 900. But I so miss it now. Sort of looking back, I wish I had another subject that was like an epic. That was sort of my Moby Dick. I used to say, half jokingly, that was my Moby Dick. I had wanted to write a novel also about Joe Louis that would have that epic suite and have a lot of politics, but that for many reasons, and now it would be considered appropriation of a subject, I probably wouldn't undertake to do that now. Some years ago, I might have written that. But
right. I love this question about favorites amongst your novels. Do you have a sense of the way your perspective on writing or writing particularly novels has changed between them and Blonde, or the new novel, which I will hold up for people, called Night, Sleep, Death, the Stars?
wonderful title from Walt Whitman.
Yeah, it comes from Whitman, and it's out June 9th.
Well, I would say, and speaking very broadly, my imagination swings between realism and surrealism, between the gritty and wonderful sensuous reality that James Joyce loved to write, and more like the gothic, almost allegorical novels that are more hallucinatory and dreamlike. Or it could be experimental. I even have a sort of science fiction novel that takes place in the future called Hazards of Time Travel, which for me was a departure. But if you're a realist, you get great pleasure out of replicating the real world and realistic dialogue and psychological realism. But if you're impatient with that and really want to delve into the unconscious, like you're a surrealist or Dadaist, or more interested in, say, fairy tales, that kind of writing, or science fiction or speculative fiction, then you turn your back on reality and you go into another world. It's like another region of the imagination. Well, Alice in Wonderland is in that region. It's down the rabbit hole or through the looking glass, but it's not realism.
Right, right. I want to ask one more question, and I will urge people who are watching to send questions. You once talked about the influence of movies on your novel, and you said they inspired you to a cinematic sort of storytelling driven by character and plot, and that as a writer, you would strive for the fluency, suspense, and heightened drama of film in quick cuts and leaps in time. Could you say a bit about that?
Yes, those are certain kinds of novels and novellas that move very quickly. The Blonde is not one of those novels, really. There are scenes in it that are cinematic, but the structure of it is much more like a history. It's like a quasi autobiography or biography. So Blonde is a little different. But I do have novels that nobody would notice this. I'm sure nobody would ever notice this, but I have a novel called The Tattooed Girl. And at the very end of it, in the last chapter, I believe, like at the very end, I'm taking the strategy of that climatic scene in Hitchcock's Psycho. Now, you have to put your minds back, and I did this very deliberately, and nobody would know. I mean, somebody walks into a room, and there's this corpse that's in a chair with a wig that you can't see. And you're seeing something from above. I haven't seen this scene in a while, so I can't describe it in more detail. Hitchcock takes the camera up to the ceiling so that you see the tops of people's heads, but you don't see exactly who they are. It's such an adroit and startling thing to do because the camera is usually at eye level and the camera is horizontal. Hitchcock takes the camera up to the ceiling and we're looking down suddenly and something happens, but we don't see all of it because we're up in the ceiling. So I use that technique, that particular scene from Hitchcock.
Wow. So here is a question that just came in. How could you say more? This is from Ellen Diamond. Could you say more about how voice becomes experimental?
Well, it used to be that stories that you might read in the New Yorker. I mean, some years ago, decades ago, they were stories that were based upon a model of Chekhov or James Joyce. The New Yorker published a lot of William Trevor. Those are well-crafted stories that are narrated. Then we move into a more experimental kind of fiction. In New Yorker published John Cheever, who has many, many, many realistic features in his writing, but he also has somewhat dreamlike, fairy tale, mythic, and bizarre images start to intrude. Maybe because he was a confirmed alcoholic, because that actually helps some writers, freeze their unconscious. Now, moving swiftly ahead to contemporary times. If you read the New Yorker, you're very likely to read a story told in a voice. It may be a very marginal voice. It could be an idiomatic voice. It could be the voice of an illiterate person. It could be a voice of some child from a third world country. In other words, it used to be open in the New Yorker. You'd read a very coherent sort of white folks, middle class, educated narration derived from Chekhov or Joyce or John O'Hara.
Yes.
Now we come to all sorts of ethnic and gender experimentations with gender and all sorts of different perspectives. You might open the New Yorker and read a story that's totally surreal by George Saunders. It's in a voice that's a weird, not a realistic voice. Yeah. So those are all different ways of writing.
Right. Here's the question. I've lost the name. Oh, from Jennifer Merritt. How is the pandemic currently affecting your writing, or how do you see it affecting your writing in the future?
Well, most writers, I think, are they're working on projects that take a while to conceive. So the work that I'm writing on right now is something that I was working on before the lockdown. But I have to say that I don't get as much work done now as I did before the lockdown when I was going out and teaching and seeing more people. There's something about a writer being trapped in a room and having to write, where the writer suddenly had wanted all this special time, but then suddenly you don't want them anymore. So it's almost like an inverse ratio. If you have 30 hours, you get much less done than you used to get done in 3 hours.
Or in my case, you get nothing done.
But you're reading, but we're all reading a lot, I think.
Yeah.
I think the enemy of any kind of artistic effort is distraction and interruption. So if your mind is fragmented and you can't sit still and concentrate, even though you're all alone in your house, you're so anxious about the social situation outside your house, you can't write as well as you did before this.
Right. From Bonnie Parks. It's interesting that you mention appropriation. How do you feel about the debate regarding cultural appropriation in fiction? It seems as if, I've lost my place, we are required to stick with writing about only our own kind or gender. And if we do this, we wouldn't have, for example, the #1 ladies detective agency, Anna Karenina, or the controversial American Dirt. That's a great question.
Thank you, Bonnie. That's a very astute question. I think we need a whole forum on that subject. Many of the writers whom I know, like Zadie Smith, who's my wonderful colleague and friend at NYU, Zadie Smith published an excellent article on this subject in the New York Review of Books maybe about a year ago. And there are other writers of color. Jamaica Kincaid gave a little talk on the subject. She said, please appropriate me. We all need to appropriate one another. I want you to appropriate my subjects and I will appropriate your subjects. The writers themselves, like Zadie Smith and Jamaica Kincaid, and probably Colson Whitehead and probably Toni Morrison, the writers themselves feel very comfortable with using their own imagination. And Toni Morrison has a novel in which a white character is the main character. And Toni Morrison herself, she was a friend and colleague at Princeton. Toni believed that the imagination was the primary region of creativity is the imagination. So she saw no problem in her own appropriation of slave narratives and writing about uneducated persons of color, very different from her. And Faulkner saw no problem in writing about uneducated poor whites who are very different from him. It's more something that has come up in recent years. Does a man have a right to write about women? There was a lot of dismay and disdain for D.H. Lawrence writing about women from his perspective. It was felt that he was a man and he shouldn't be writing about women. But on the other hand, I think common sense will tell us that it's very cruel and crude and even self-defeating to take on a voice of some ethnic minority whom you don't know very well and try to exploit it. It might be better for you to enter the fiction as a white person encountering or witnessing or meeting some of these other people who are different from you and therefore respecting the differences.
Right. There are two questions about publishing. The first one from Jade Driscoll says, do you have any advice about navigating the publishing industry?
Oh, this is hard to answer. I don't really know that much. I don't know what to say. It is a different world. When I came into the publishing world, I was so young and everything was different. A publisher would stay with a writer who sold like 500 copies. My first book finally sold its first edition finally was all sold in like 20 years later. But I'm afraid today, if you're a young writer, you might get 1 or 2 chances. Your first novel, if it didn't really sell well, they might possibly publish another one. But if it doesn't sell well, they look at the computer and they see what the numbers are. So when I was first publishing, I don't want to shock you, but computers didn't exist. Publishers were much more it's like a family house. A publisher might be a house family owned that publishing house. Now they're all kind of conglomerates and enormous corporations where the bottom line is what's being sold, how much. So it's a different world. I'm very lucky to be at Echo Press, which is an imprint, and it's little like a family house, which is owned and operated by Daniel Halpern and has been for decades. But he's at HarperCollins, which is a large corporation, and they give Dan a good deal of autonomy. So today it is a different world. You can make a killing as a writer, but it's hard to make a living.
I remember you've talked about this before and I think that you and Ray Smith once ran a small publishing house for first-time novelists.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's a comment from Stephen Winograd. How terrific hearing you speak. I'm writing short stories and mysteries. I'm approaching magazines on my own. If I turn any of my ideas into a novel, do you recommend finding an agent at that point? Thank you.
Well, I would find an agent after I had a solid manuscript. The agents don't really want to read. They're not going to read them. They probably won't take on a novel unless it's fairly complete. You know?
Right.
So you can't get a good agent.
Yeah. From Jason Wadi. I'm a former boxer and I come from a family of Irish fighters. Well, where does your passion for boxing come from?
Well, that's a good question. My interest in boxing completely derived from my father, Fred Oates. He was friendly with a middleweight boxer who lived in Buffalo, New York, and we went often to see the Golden Gloves fights. And he watched boxing on television every Friday night. I think also sometimes on Wednesday nights. So I watched
Gillette Friday Night Fights. My father watched that.
Yeah, but you didn't somehow become infatuated with it.
Oh, I didn't.
So to me, the Golden Gloves were a phenomenon because there were almost no women or girls there. It was really very masculine. And I hate to remember this, but it was blue with smoke. You know, people were smoking even at sporting events indoors. In those days, people smoked in hospitals. People smoked in airplanes. So I was introduced to this macho world where I was really a little girl, about 11 or 12. And I was not a feminist. I wasn't looking at it with critical skills. I was just sort of enthralled by what the drama. And then, of course, the boxing matches themselves are extraordinarily dramatic. When you see a boxing match live, it doesn't have any mediation. There are no announcers. You don't really know what's happening. You're just sort of staring. You're riveted staring at a spectacle that you have no language for.
Wow. So here's a question from Kathy Cahoe. You wrote about abortion in your novel, A Book of American Martyrs, and before that in a short story called A Book of Martyrs. What was the process of developing the short story into the novel form?
Well, the interesting thing is that short story never got into the novel. I would have thought that it would be in the novel myself, but the novel, there's so many things I could say about it. I wanted to write a novel about the issue of abortion and how it impacts on people's lives, particularly politically. But I wanted to write a novel, and nobody noticed this, of course, in which there would not be an abortion. You don't have to, I thought I can write a novel about abortion and we don't have to have that obligatory chapter where a woman or a girl has an abortion. So it's not in there. And I thought that might be interesting if anybody notices. It's sort of counterintuitive. So the story itself is about an abortion and about a subjective experience, but the novel is about men, a lot of men in the novel. And then it moves toward two women, young women at the very end. And the end of the novel is a younger generation and two women who sort of come together. But neither one of them has an abortion. I thought it was a tour de force.
Well, I actually like that novel enormously and have to say that the way you show the kind of sympathy to the murderers, so to speak, as you do to the abortions, the people on the side of abortion, is to me a very moving moments in the novel throughout, as you watch a whole community sort of upended by the murder, etc.
Well, it was not a murder, Barry. It was an assassination.
Oh, well, that was okay. Assassination. Thank you.
That,
Okay,
that's
here's from Daniel Antonellis,
well,
whom I
that's
taught in the 1970s or 80s. What did you say? I missed that.
I'm not hearing you at the moment.
Can you hear me
My
now?
screen is freezing a little. I hear you.
Okay. Here's
Yeah.
from Daniel Antonellis. When you begin writing a novel, are you clear on where the characters will go and what the ending will be, or does that change as the story unfolds?
Well, I certainly recommend that you think through your novel. Go for a long walk. I mean, maybe it was a walk that's going to take weeks or months, and work through your novel as if it were a dream and get to the end of it. If you don't get to the end of it, you're going to have a very hard time writing it. So with my novel, A Book of American Martyrs, I knew exactly how it was going to end, and I will give it away because I think it was a beautiful ending. It ends in an embrace of two people who should, in a way, have been enemies, but they suddenly realize that they have suffered something that nobody else understands, and they impulsively embrace. So that's the very end of the novel. And I'm hoping that for all of America, that with the younger generation, we can move towards something like that.
Yeah, nice. Here's the thing about from Charles Wasilewski. Is there anything distinctive in your view about working in the culture and environment of New Jersey that has played into your fiction or might be relevant to explore in the future?
Oh, well, certainly. When I wrote my novel, The Accursed, it's set right on the Princeton campus, much of it, and in Princeton Village, the village of Princeton at that time in 1906. So I used the Firestone Library for research. I was looking at Woodrow Wilson's personal letters and all sorts of things about Woodrow Wilson because he's one of the main characters.
Yes, he is very much.
And that novel, I would never have written that novel if I hadn't lived in New Jersey. And there's some other stories, fiction set in New Jersey.
Right. This is from Stefan Robelin, thanking you for the rich conversation and said, could you talk a little bit about what motivates you to approach and dialogue with prior writers in your own work? I'm thinking about a short story like The Dead. What drives you to this approach, and do you find it invigorating, daunting, or something else?
We have a whole sequence of stories with titles from great works like The Dead, the lady with the pet dog, and Kafka's The Metamorphosis. I also did The House of Bly, which is, of course, The Turn of the Screw. I have two stories about The Turn of the Screw, one with that title and the other called The House of Bly. Then I have another story, which is a novella, it's a long story about Henry James. So I'm clearly so interested, in a way, infatuated with some of my great predecessors. I have a couple stories about Emily Dickinson.
I know, I was going to bring that up, yes.
I loved anything about Emily Dickinson. I want to do more if I can. Mark Twain and Ernest Hemingway, Kafka, Edgar Allan Poe, Robert Frost. That was one of my favorites. I got in a lot of trouble in my story. Lovely, Dark and Deep. Lovely, Dark and Deep, which is a young woman goes to interview an elderly Robert Frost. And the things that Robert Frost says are really somewhat shocking. So people criticized me and they said, why did you put those words in Robert Frost's mouth? And I said, I didn't. They're all from interviews and things he said. So he was a racist and he was a misogynist and he said awful things. He was also a great poet. But it was the same thing with Woodrow Wilson. People said, where did you get those awful things that Woodrow Wilson said and did? I said, I didn't get that anywhere. It's history.
I'm not going to touch that one. It's history. Here's a wonderful question from Jerry Dodge, whom I also told.
Barry, can I interrupt real quick? We have to do one last question.
Okay, Jerry Dodge. He said, "How did Jinx Fairchild emerge as such a powerful character, and because it is bitter?"
Well, it's actually, the novel's actually dedicated to a boy whom I knew remotely. I didn't know him well. He was a boy like Jinx, so very charismatic, a black boy who was in my junior high school when I went to this Lockport, New York. So I looked upon him at a distance with great respect and interest. As I said, he was charismatic. He was very popular, very strong.
I'm going. She said I had one question, but let me do one more or two. Here's a question from Peter Potts. Who is Rosamund Smith?
Well, Rosamund Smith had the initials of my first husband, Ray Smith. So Rosamund Smith was a kind of alter ego. She was writing fiction that was more like cinema, fast moving, a lot of dialogue, and with surprise endings.
Right. Do you still do any Rosamund Smith?
No, she got retired because she was outed.
She was outed. That's a good one. One more question, and then I'll stop. Here's from Christian Fisher. Hold on, I've just lost it. You spoke a little about the demands of the short story form on a writer. What are some of the demands of the novel on a writer in terms of form?
Well, the demands of the writer as a novelist are just enormous. You sort of feel like you have to be an eagle and fly high and look down. You have to be a burro or a donkey. You have to be something like a cockroach and very, going across the floor very minutely. And as I say, I'm not exactly encouraging people to write novels, but I hope that people will read novels.
We should all encourage everybody to read novels every day of their lives. It has been such a pleasure this past hour, and I also want to thank all of our guests online who've asked questions and written in wonderful things. And I want to stop with a comment from Commonweal magazine that Joyce Carol Oates is the most relentless chronicler of America and its nightmares since Edgar Allan Poe.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you very much. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Joyce and Barry. Thank you so much to you and to the audience. And don't forget to you'll be able to access this through a link, and you can share it with your friends and family. And I invite you all to come back next week when our guest will be Susan Schneider, a Rutgers alumna, who will be discussing artificial intelligence and the future of mind. So thank you again, Joyce, and thank you again, Barry. It was fascinating, and looking forward to seeing you in the usual way one day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.
Bye-bye.